Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of the Midwest Gaming Classic Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garris, Panel Director of the Midwest Gaming Classic. This episode is all about Joe Decuir and Marty Goldberg discussing the development behind the legendary Atari VCS or 2600 home video game console, which happens to be the very first video game console I received as a young boy. And I was able to get one really cheap because my mom was able to find one at a rummage sale. And I'd say that it was between the early 80s to mid 80s when the Nintendo NES system became popular. A lot of people, there were kind of like two times when the Atari 2600 could be found at rummage sales back in the day, and that was after the video game crash, and then when the Nintendo NES system, the original NES system, came out. People didn't want the Atari 2600 anymore because, well, the Nintendo NES was out and the graphics were better and the gameplay was better. So I was able to luckily get an Atari 2600 early to mid 1980s, and it was my very first console, and in actuality, it's the very first console that ever came out. Now, you can think about the early consoles before then, which I don't know if you could really consider them consoles because they were variations on the game Pong, and they were, they represented what a console could look like. They either had controllers that were on them or controllers that could come off of them, but they were always tethered with a cord of some sort. So the Atari 2600 was the first system that had a plug and play with the controllers. So, but you know what? Enough of me talking. Why don't we get to the podcast?
Joe Decuir is the main hardware designer behind the Atari 2600 game console, or the Atari VCS as it was known at the time of its release. Marty Goldberg, who has been with the show since 2001, has been in touch with Joe for many years and has tried to convince him to come out to the show. And for a long time, Joe had kind of been hesitant to come, and this year Marty convinced him to come out and share all of his history, because not just has Joe done this, but he's been involved in many of the huge milestones in gaming and computing history. And Joe absolutely loved the show, and he had a great time speaking, as you'll see in this panel.
So, hey everyone, thanks for coming out for another one of these great presentations. This time it's not on Skype. We actually have the person here in person. Joe was grateful enough to come in to the show. We're trying to get him to come out for years, and he was finally able to, and I greatly appreciate it. So for those not familiar, this is Joe Decuir. He's the co-inventor of the Atari 2600, the Atari 8-bit computers, and the Amiga, and he had a hand in USB 2.0 and a number of other great things that he'll tell you about too. But very esteemed member of the IEEE, and he's one of the main people, if anybody, that's the reason that a lot of you guys are here, that there's even an industry going on because of the Atari 2600. So we're going to do, hopefully these guys get the display going at some point. It's got his PowerPoint presentation of some stuff he wanted to illustrate. But in the meantime, we're just going to talk it out. And really that's the reason he's here, is to tell his story about...
And to hear your questions and answer you.
Yeah. And so we'll be taking questions in between. If you guys have questions, raise your hand during it. We'll do his best to answer it. But let's just get started then with talking about it. So if you could explain to them, so what were you doing in the early 70s before you came to Atari? What was some of your technical background? Where did you go to school? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in LA. I was a surfer. I never saw snow until I was 18. I went to college to major in electrical engineering, computer science. I did a minor in pre-med. because I wanted to do something with engineering other than drop bombs on other people, which is what my father did. So I went to Cal, and I'm learning all this stuff, and as a side effect, I'm studying computer architecture, and I got a chance to study microprocessors when they were brand new. Microprocessors were first introduced by Intel in 1971. So I was technically curious, I was learning about stuff, and then I was in the right place at the right time. In the summer of 1975, I grew up in Southern California. We're walking down the streets in Disneyland in Anaheim. Funny noises in the background. I wonder what they are. And we go over there, there's feedback, and I'm 24 years old, my youngest brother is 12. We go in there, we find Atari Tank, the arcade game. We waste a lot of quarters, we play a lot of Tank. He's got better reflexes than I am, he beats me consistently. But this was fortuitous for me because I was introduced to how to play, arcade Tank. Meantime, years later, 1968, Ralph Baer, who there's an exhibit about him in the history area, was the original inventor of video games, except that he didn't work for a consumer electronics company, he worked for a defense contractor, Sanders. Fortunately, they gave him some money to keep doing his work, but they didn't really know what to do with this stuff. And finally, they arranged to meet up with Magnavox, and he sold the design to the Magnavox people and became the original Magnavox Odyssey, which was a home Pong game, came out in 1972, the year that I graduated from Berkeley. When I graduated from Berkeley, I was unconscious of video games. I was thinking about going to medical school, right? Do something useful with all this technology. But he did that work, and in 1972, Nolan Bushnell, who founded Atari, who wanted to create, electronic entertainment in arcades, saw that game, and he saw the winning game design. So he arranged for Al Alcorn, an old friend of mine, to actually implement the arcade version of Pong, which is on display out there. It was a big winner. Those of you who have not heard the story before, they installed it in a bar in Sunnyvale, California, and after a couple of days it stopped working. They called up Atari, say, this is not working, come fix it. They came to fix it, and it didn't work because the coin box was full of quarters, and it wouldn't take any more money. They knew they had a winner. So Atari went on to construct the arcade game business, and they did more complex games, including that tank game that I learned to play at Disneyland a couple of summers later. I was learning about microprocessors in my spare time. In the fall of 1977, I went to the Westcon show in San Francisco and bought a 6502. Coincidentally, Wozniak bought one the same day. Coincidentally, the guys who would eventually hire me bought one the same day. I didn't know these things. This is an example of luck favoring the prepared mind. So I had learned to play video games, and I had learned about that processor before I knew that I was going to lose my job in medical research and need to go find another job. I was offered two jobs. One was to design medical electronics gadgets in Orange County, and the other was to work for this video game company. And I chose the latter because they were going to teach me electronic skills that I didn't already have, like how to design big custom integrated circuits. I thought, that's a valuable skill. You should always take jobs that teach you more stuff that you already know. So I took the job, and kind of the rest is history. No luck yet? So, here we are. I am well prepared. I go for the interview. I passed the technical parts of the interview because I'd been educating myself on the microprocessors that I didn't know that they were interested in yet. And then they walked me out to the lobby, and there's a bunch of Atari coin-out games with no coin slots. And I realized I'm going to be tested. And so I slide over to the tank game, figuring I can play a passable game, and I do, and I was hired on the spot. So that's how I got in the door in this particular industry at this time in history. Right, okay, so Atari has figured out how to entertain people and extract quarters out of their pockets. they bring that home. That came out, the home version of Pong came out in 1975, for those of you old enough to remember it. And they separately had a coin-op version of Tank that I had played that summer. And they wanted to complete the square. They wanted to take the complex games home. That's the choice that they had to make. How are they going to do that? They considered at least two different ways to do it. One is a random design, where all the intelligence is on the card, and then maybe you plug it into a system that has the controls. And, Coleco did a design like that, where they had 3 sets of controls. You put in a little triangular thing on it, it got all the electronics in it. You just have whatever. So they tried that, but we at Atari were thinking, we'd like to make one that's, cartridge controlled in some fashion. And the question is, can we do it at that time in history? At that time in history, 1,000 bits of RAM cost $5 a piece. 1,000 bits. Okay? How many of you got a mobile phone on you? How many gigabytes do they have in them? Right. Gigabytes is a billion bits. Okay. So memory was radically more expensive at that time. And we thought, well, the obvious way to build a programmable system is to have a bitmap. And that's going to cost us way too much money in 1975, 1976. What are we going to do? Well, the trick is, a microprocessor came out, the 6502, that was fast enough to do a display on a line-by-line basis rather than a whole screen at once. So most of that code is just driving the hardware, bang, bang, bang. And a little bit is thinking about what to do next. So, next slide. So I had learned that microprocessor that fall. Next slide. So Atari, 2 guys that hired me, did a paper design for something that used that 6502 fast processor for the time, driving a wire wrap board. So in this display, here's the processor board, here is 4K bytes of memory, and here is the wire wrap that's going to drive the TV. It's not the final design, it's what you would call an existence proof. How many of you have ever heard of a book called The Mythical Man Month? Some of you. Okay. It's an excellent book on managing software engineering, and one of the things it says that you should plan to throw the first one away. Don't ship your prototype. You use your prototype to prove that you know how to do something. And what we did here is we built a prototype to prove that we could do something. I was hired to come get it to work, because it didn't work. It had several bugs to fix. I fixed all the bugs in a few weeks, and then we invited the Atari brass up there to see it, and they said, green light, okay, you're going to go move to the Santa Clara Valley, and you're going to apprentice to this guy, and the 2 of you are going to make this into a real product.
Let me just interject one thing here. So if you could tell everybody what it was like actually being hired, what was the hiring process like, and a little bit about Cyan too, because I don't think they're as familiar with it.
Atari had a think tank in the California foothills. If you know where Grass Valley or Nevada City are, if you go east out of Sacramento, up over the mountains, that's where you go through. And they had this small team of 12, 14 people there. When I was interviewed, I didn't have a beard, but all of the men had beards, and they were dressed like lumberjacks. So I went to work every day in a Pendleton shirt and hiking boots, and I grew a beard. I've still got it. My kids don't know what I look like without one. It was fun. Actually, the whole place was fun. But they were teaching me a lot of stuff that I needed to know. Any further I should go on that before I go on? Okay, so I moved to the Santa Clara Valley. I had more hair and I was lighter. Okay, next slide. I was apprenticed to this gentleman. He died 22 years ago. His name is Jay Miner. He was my mentor. We worked together on the 2600. We worked together on the Atari computers, and we worked together later on the Amiga computers. The latter two machines are the subject of tomorrow's conversation. Next slide. Okay, so we did a production version of the design, and it had that same microprocessor in a cut-down box. It had a game program plugged into the ROM on the front. It had an off-the-shelf thing that had 1,000 bits of memory, 120 bytes. How many of you are familiar with SMS? Messaging on your phones. That's 160 characters. 160 bytes is more memory than this machine had. Okay, for perspective. And then we designed one new custom chip that replaced that prototype. And that drove video out, and we did some of the other stuff, and we set up these two game control connectors there. That's what this represents. Next
How
slide.
did you guys decide to use those specific D connectors?
Sure. Well, at that time in history, D connectors were common. A lot of other connectors didn't exist yet. Common connectors were 9-pin D connectors and 25-pin D connectors. And we chose the 9-pin because that was sufficient. We didn't want to have to deal with 25. We didn't yet know that even those connectors would fatigue if you plugged and unplugged stuff often enough. But they were readily available, they were cheap, and they were sufficient.
I asked that because they became ubiquitously known as the Atari connectors
I know.
to so many people.
They were reused by Atari on our computers. They were used and reused by Commodore on their machines. They were used on the Amiga. And Coleco made some machines that used them too. And then when the game business collapsed in 83, 84, and they restarted, Nintendo made up their own connectors that were, I think, better for withstanding being plugged and unplugged. But that's what we had at the time. There is no smarts inside any of the 4 kinds of controllers that plugged into this. There were simple switch closures and potentiometers. More modern controllers had little tiny 4-bit microprocessors in them that would scan all the switches and convert them to serial bit streams and send them back on fewer connectors. But that happened later. Does that answer your question? Okay. So here's the circuit board. They're over in my backpack. I brought a handful of exhibits, and one of them is that physical circuit board. All right, real. Now, a comparison. See this? That's what's in it. And you might think, why did it have to be so big? Answer, Atari marketing. Atari marketing looked at the market for products that sold for $200 retail in 1976. And they said, the closest approximation is a top-loading audio cassette player. It weighs about this much. We need to put a lot of packaging weight into this thing so that people will feel like it's worth $200. Now, what's also true is this thing fits inside. You can kind of see it around the edge of the connector. There's actually an aluminum casting all around the circuit board. This is very RF quiet because in the mid-1970s, this thing hooked up to a TV antenna, which could also then go out to the antenna on your roof and possibly generate matching displays on all of their equipment too. They didn't want to see this or hear the tech support calls. So we had much tighter RFI design rules at Atari than the rest of the industry had because they weren't driving monitors. That's why this thing is inside an aluminum casting. The original Atari computers were inside something similar. They're boat anchors. You could drive a car with this and the electronics would still work. But they made it big for perceived value reasons. not because it needed to be that big. Later, they didn't care. And later, the RFI rules got lighter, so they made much smaller machines. But that was another story for later. Okay, so we finally got ready to ship this thing in 1977. At ship time, we had a heavy sixer. These are the 2 cartridges that I worked on myself. And we had 4 pairs of controllers. It came bundled with a pair of joysticks. Everybody knows what those are by now. And it came with a pair of paddle controllers because upper management insisted that this thing be able to play tank games and Pong games. That's why I shipped those, because I needed to write the existence proofs. We built these things, which were shaped the same, but they were gray-coated because they rotated 360 degrees for the driving games. And we built these things in case we built anything that could display characters to have a little keyboard controller. Anything maybe educational. That's what we came out with in 1977. Next slide. So, for those of you who are technical, I apologize, but this is actually about program flow. How many of you know how to code? Many of you. Okay, so any computer is executing instructions in memory, and at different times it'll be doing different things. And in this video game, they're synchronized with the displays. And classic TVs, not these things, but the old ones, you know, the ones with CRTs and stuff, you know, electron beams, right? They are scanning a beam back and forth across the screen, and then at the bottom of the screen, they move the whole thing back up again. So during vertical blanking, the beam is moving up, the magnets are turning it one direction, and all the video is off. And during that time is when the processor running the game is examining the state of the game, what touched what are the state of the controls, and so what should the next state of the game be? That's what it does in this time. And then when it gets to the top of the screen, it starts retracing rapidly and displaying new stuff pulled out of memory and shoved into the hardware. The processor that we chose was fast enough that we could do this on a line-by-line basis rather than having to write a whole frame. Now, we, the designers, did this because we were cheap, because we couldn't afford enough memory for a memory map in 1976. What we didn't know, the huge thing that happened with this design, was that by making it a line-oriented thing, we put the design of the vertical in the hands of the programmers, who turned out to be radically smarter than we realized. I can't underscore this enough. They were a lot smarter than we imagined that they were. And we thought that this design was going to have a market life of 2 or 3 years before other things blew it away, like the Intellivision. Okay? But it actually shipped 30 million units in the first 8 to 10 years of production. And even more importantly, you can still buy them today, but we'll get there. That's how it worked. The next slide. So I wrote the display engine for the combat to prove that it could be done, and did the hardware-software trade-offs for that. And then, as an afterthought, I had written let's prove that Pong can be done. And we got the hardware to work, and my boss said, "Oh, you're supposed to do the Pong cartridge." Really? Oh, I forgot. I was hoping that they would forget. They didn't. So I said, "How many variations do I have to come up with?" And they said 50. So I came up with, obviously, Pong and Super Pong, and then we did Foos Pong. How many of you actually played this game before? Right, a few of you. Super Pong, well, Foos Pong is where you have several players lined up and they're replicated vertically. So it sort of looks like foosball. And the interesting thing, it's fun to see, but the game moves so quickly. The ball touches so many paddles so fast that it's almost unplayable. But we didn't have a collection of people to go do game testing on. Start to finish was 3 months. Now this is only 2,000 bytes. of programming, right? So how long could it possibly take, right? So did that. Did handball, where it bounced off the side of the wall rather than across a virtual net. We did volleyball, where the ball went this way over a different net. We did basketball, where I put little things up there to try to pop it into. True story. 1988. I've gotten married. I have 3 little kids. And my 6-year-old goes off to first grade, and he comes home and I say, Michael, what did you learn today? And he said, I learned to play handball. A handball with the big fat balls. I have something to show you. So I go in the garage and I get out my 2600 because I don't have it set up yet. And I pull up Video Olympics and I play handball with my son. And it has difficulty switches. So my paddle is this big and his is this big, right? So you can have mismatched players. He's 6 years old. He has the reflexes of a cobra. He masters the game immediately. After 3 games of this, we're playing even. Michael, what do you think of this game? He said, Dad, this is hecka fresh. And I'm like, what? And I suddenly realized that I'm on the other side of the generation gap. My son is cool and hip, and he's 6 years old, and I'm 38 and I'm over the hill. Things haven't changed. Although he did, as a teenager, frequently say, Dad, you were cool once. Yeah, that's true. Next slide.
Let me just ask you one question here. So when you had the luxury, you're the co-designer of this, and you're actually coding it directly on the hardware, I'm assuming you can test it. A lot of the other guys like Crane and them, were they able to do that too? Did they have to use the 6502 simulator on the mainframe and then dump it like I heard a lot of them had?
By the time we hired Dave Crane, I think we built 5 or 6 hardware emulators.
Okay.
And then, fortunately, the chips worked the first time. So Dave Crane did the wild majority of his work against the real hardware. This here is the TIA design manual. This was a trade secret in the late 70s. This one is signed by Jay Miner and Ralph Baer. Let's see, where were we? Keep going. All right, that's what the tank game looked like with an intermediate display. Next slide. All right, production history. This is the 1977 version. This is the 2014 version. People are still making these things now. You could probably go to Mall of America over in Minneapolis, and there's probably one of them in a toy store somewhere. Although this one is emulated. The prototype that I bought from a buddy of his recently is the FPGA version of the Flashback 2.0. The important thing is, they're still around. I mean, if you go back to 1970 and think, what consumer products are still selling in 2016 that were selling 39 years ago? The answer is not very many of them at all. You can't buy, well, you can actually go buy retro vinyl record players again because they're starting to come back. You probably can't buy an 8-track. You probably can't buy a cassette tape player. You can't buy the analog TVs, are not legal anymore. You know, what's around that was around back then, and this is one of the few examples. Next. And people are still developing new software for it. My friend Ed Fries, a fellow Microsoft escapee, had arranged for Halo to be done for the original Xbox. He ported it to the 2600, and they sell this now. One of the great experiences of my life was what they now call Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving. Big shopping day. 1977, I go to the Sears store in Mountain View, California, which is where I live. They have one of these, a 27-inch analog color TV, right? This is a Sears store. And they have the Sears branded version of this, and they've got the tank game in there, and everything is nailed down. And parents will come in with their kids. The kids will get in line to play the new game. waiting their turn to play the game. The game is simple enough that they can figure out how to play it by watching it. So when it's then their turn, they know what to do. And then their parents will come out, and if they've had a chance to play, they can probably get their kids out of the store. And if the kids haven't had a chance to play yet, there's this big fight because they don't want to leave, because they want their turn. And I watched this for 2 hours, and I thought, oh my God, what have we done? I've been married twice, and both of my spouses have said it's your fault for turning our children into couch potatoes. Your fault. But it was so damn much fun. I would go to work and they were paying me to do this? Really? You know, we used to joke about having a little coffee can with a coin slot on top, and we'd have to put quarters in there to keep working. And the joke was that Bushnell was collecting all the quarters. Anyway, next slide. All right, what did we learn? We learned that we put the display in the hands of the game designers, and they were way smarter than we were. There were at least 1,000 different titles published for that machine. Some of them caused the crash, but it was a wildly successful market. Our conclusion was that our next system had to be more flexible to give the programmers the ability to do things that we couldn't imagine that they were going to do. And we realized we had created a platform, the art of other people. The Smithsonian Institution, the American National Museum, 4 years ago did a 9-month exhibit called Art of the Video Game. I recommend it. And I learned about it because somebody was there and they saw this machine display and a reference to combat, and they said, "Is that you?" So I saved up my money and my frequent flyer miles, and I flew out there to see this in person at the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery. And then I discovered, wonderful surprise to me, was that it was going to be a traveling exhibit, and it was going to spend 3 months at the Experience Music Project in Seattle, which is approximately where I live. And even better, it overlapped when my oldest son, the video gamer, got married. So all these people fly from all over the country to my son's wedding, and I get to take them to EMP to see this machine. And they're like, "Ooh, that's so cool." That was fun. That was fun. We thought we needed to move fast because we didn't think this was going to last very long in the market. And we were surprised. Anyway, next item. Last item. Okay, let's suppose you want to learn more about this. Find this book, Racing the Beam. It's about how it all works, including a lot of the cartridges. I wrote an article about the technical details, and it's called Game On. It's published by IEEE. If you ping me individually, I can send you a copy, but it's not published because IEEE owns the rights. The best book that I know of on the social history of Atari, this guy and his buddy wrote Business is Fun. And my friend Warren Robinett, who wrote the 2600 version of Adventure, is writing a book that explains it in excruciating detail, and it's going to be called The Annotated Adventure. It'll come out sometime this year or next year. I'm not sure. When I write the sequel to that book, it's going to have a port of his game to the computer, which we'll talk about tomorrow.
So since we're going to squeeze in both sets of the computers tomorrow, let's talk for a second about why you wound up leaving Atari.
Atari needed a lot of money in 1976 because they were anticipating correctly that this was going to cost an astonishing amount of money to build for production. So they looked for buyers, and they found a buyer in Warner Communications, which thought it was in the business of electronic entertainment. So Warner bought them out, and they gave Nolan, the total sell price was $28 million, and half of that wound up in Nolan Bushnell's hands. And he did some irresponsible things with it. And more to the point, he kind of took his eye off the ball in terms of marketing. I believe we made a huge mistake, a simple mistake in the design of this. In order to save $1 in 1977 production numbers, we've made the 6502 in a 28-pin rather than a 40-pin package. and we made the cartridge slot 28 pins rather than 30 pins. If we had stretched the design a little bit, there would have been an evolutionary path from this machine to a computer successor. But we closed that door because we weren't looking far enough down the road. We weren't planning the whole sequence out. We were getting a product out because we needed to get it out. Because we thought if we didn't do it, our competitors would kill us, right? So we took our eye off the ball. We prematurely optimized. And so when we did our second system, it needed to be a clean break from this because this wasn't expandable logically as it could have been. So we jumped far to the next much better system, but in doing so, the market had looked at our success and branded us as a game company. So if we come up with a new game system and it's not compatible with the old system, then it loses because people have shipped hundreds and hundreds of games that run on the old system and not on the new one. So we orphaned ourselves in the market. We didn't realize what we had done to this ourselves because we hadn't looked far enough down the road. Now, given that, Atari doubled its sales volume every year, but they'd managed to lose money. Of course, they had Warner accountants managing to write off everything. So after 2 years of this, they replaced Nolan Bushnell with a guy named Ray Kassar from the fabric business. Ray said, we're going to make these computers in designer colors so that women will buy them. Most of the women who worked in engineering were gone within 2 months. My boss, Jay Miner, lasted 2 months. I stuck around at Atari long enough to get the computers ready for production, in particular the production test stuff, the stuff that makes sure that each unit has enough quality to ship. And then I went off to work on communications. Why did I do that? I had been reading the trade press, thinking about where the rest of the industry is going. And I read about the French Minitel system, which was prototyping internet applications on a French private network. But I looked at that and I said, the future is communications, not video games, at least for me. So I went off into communication, and I spent most of my subsequent career working on electronic communications. And so I saw other places to go besides there. I hooked up back with Jay Miner in 1982 because we wanted to build our third system, which I'll talk about more tomorrow. But Ray chased us out.
So we have about a few minutes to start taking questions from the audience then before we wrap it up. So I'll come out here and you'll stay here. Who has the first question? Anybody have anything?
Yes, sir. Wait for the mic so we can all hear your question.
Did you or Atari in general have anything to do with the ColecoVision and being able to plug the Atari into the ColecoVision?
No, that was Coleco reverse engineering our system.
Next question.
Yeah, how do you, Coleco came up with an Atari 2600 compatible device.
Right, and I had to testify in that lawsuit. That was very unpleasant. I'll tell you what happened. Atari was not very careful about patents in the design process. And there is a patent that should have had my name on it. I had designed the sound circuits in the 2600. But the guy who took the credit for the patent didn't include my name on the patent. Simple clerical problem. But as when Atari sued Coleco and Coleco countersued, they had to pull up my notebooks and discover that the illustration for the sound circuits in there were in my notebooks, not in Ron Milner's notebooks, and that invalidated the patent, bang, and that means they were able to sell the thing anyway in competition with us. Now the whole market fell apart, so it didn't help them very much at all, but the lawyers got paid. In my heaven, the lawyers are bored.
I've read some stories about how there was a little bit of contention between the console side and the arcade side within Atari.
There was some
Can you
tension.
speak a little bit about that?
There was some tension, but there was also a huge amount of cross-compatibility. We were buddies. I mean, we played each other in softball, but we deliberately designed the Atari computers to make it easy to port Atari arcade stuff to home use. And we understood that there were really smart people thinking about how people interacting with these machines, and we were bringing their work home. Okay? One of the problems that many companies that were competitors of Atari ran into was they didn't understand that their first job was to entertain the people, form emotional bonds with them and their little avatars on the screen. Like the Fairchild Channel F, which came out before this thing, was a market failure, sold maybe 250,000 units in its whole product lifetime. It was a clunky system and was designed by a semiconductor company thinking they could make money in games. Whereas Atari was fundamentally an entertainment company manifested in electronics. So the coin-op people were a constant source of inspiration for the consumer product side of the company. Does that answer your question? The cooperation was much stronger than the rivalry.
Hello.
Yes.
I was wondering how you felt about what people have been doing these days and taking the original console apart and using the hardware to create smaller portable versions, like Ben Heckendorn became famous for.
I want to meet him tomorrow. I understand he's not around today. Now, I've been thinking as I step back, I spent most of the last 3 decades driving commercially important public standards like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and USB and VCS modems. So I have time now that I'm officially retired to play with some of these older things. And what I envision to bring the retro game experience home, people now routinely have very powerful systems masquerading as a phone. And there are emulators like Flashback 5 that is basically emulated on a processor of comparable power. They've got the display. What they don't have is the I/O. So what I would imagine someone should do, if they don't already exist, is build Bluetooth connected classic Atari controllers and Bluetooth connected classic Nintendo controllers. Run the emulators on these things, or larger versions, because if you can talk to an emulator running on iOS, it'll run on your phone, but it'll run on your iPad. And if you connect it to an Android phone, it'll run on your Android phone, but it'll run on your Android tablet just as easily. They've already spent the money on the hardware. What they need to get is a new peripheral connected in a way that didn't exist in 1977, running on old logic. And further, I would like to popularize people able to write new games. You know, to take what Atari Age does and get people able to write retro stuff, because it's simple and it's understandable and people can get engaged in it and make it. Nolan Bushnell used to say that the best games reward the first quarter and the 100th quarter. And people who are concentrating on something simpler put their minds into that. If you've got a PS3 or a PS4 and you can render the zits on the face of the players, that's great graphics, but the question is, does it make the game interesting? And if it doesn't, then all that development is a waste of money. And it's much better to bring the gaming experience mobile. That's my opinion. Did I answer your question? More questions?
That's actually the last one we have time for today.
All right, and we can pick this back up at noon tomorrow.
Yes,
And hopefully we'll have fewer tech support issues.
So we'll be back at noon tomorrow. We'll be talking about the Atari 8-bit computers and the Amiga and the stories behind the development of those and answering some more questions. Thanks everybody for coming out. We'll see you tomorrow.
And there you go. That's the end of episode 2 of the third season of the Midwest Gaming Classic podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the development of the Atari VCS 2600 home video game system. My very first, and many people's first, video game system for their home. It's got a special place in my heart, even though, the graphics are very, very simple. The gameplay is still there, even after all these years. Now, the next episode is going to be a continuation with Joe Decuir and Marty Goldberg talking about Atari and Amiga computer engineering. So now we're going to get into how the Atari and Amiga computers back in the day were developed, which of course were developed by Joe Decuir himself. So until next time, take care, stay safe, and game on.